Okay, my name's Jonathan Cook. I'm a British journalist. I've been living in Nazareth, in Israel, northern Israel, for the last 5 years. I've come here as a freelance journalist. I was originally a staff journalist with The Guardian, but came out here to do my own projects. One of the main things was to write a book, which has taken me, I was planning to do it in about a year or 2 years, and it's taken me 5 years to do it. And the book was published in 2006 in the summer, called Blood and Religion, The Unmasking of the Jewish and Democratic State. And I also write regularly for newspapers and websites, particularly the sort of progressive alternative websites like Counterpunch, antiwar.com, Information Clearinghouse, these kind of publications.
Let's begin with your view of the conflict in Palestine-Israel when you first came to the region, and how your outlook has changed after 5 years of living here.
Well, I think I came with a slightly different perspective to start with, because one of the first things that interested me was looking at what was happening with the Palestinian community inside Israel. This is a community most people don't know a great deal about. They're a fifth of the Israeli population. They've been here since 1948. They have citizenship, and they're not, strictly speaking, part of the conflict. But it occurred to me that there was a lot that could be learnt about the conflict from looking at this community, because they are Palestinians, but they're also Israelis. They've been Israelis for nearly 6 decades. So I was interested to see how that citizenship, how they coped with that citizenship, and also how Israel coped with them being citizens when they're also Palestinians. One of the first things I noticed was that Israel seemed very reluctant to refer to them as Palestinians. It always referred to them as Israeli Arabs, or even sometimes it didn't want to refer to them as Arabs. It would refer to them as Bedouin, as Muslims, as Christians, as Druze, as their religious communities, rather than as a national group. So it intrigued me why Israel had these issues with what to call this community, why it just couldn't call them Palestinians. And in investigating that, I found out a lot of information about the history of this community and how much of that history was being concealed from them as well as from the rest of the world. For instance, in the education system here, it's still not possible for Palestinians to know anything about their history, about the Nakba, the catastrophe that happened to them as a people in 1948. In fact, I mean, they have a separate education system, so they are governed by different sets of rules. What they can teach in their schools are different from what can be taught in Israeli Jewish schools. For instance, a poet like Mahmoud Darwish cannot be taught in an Arab school, but can be taught in a Jewish school, because it's considered that there are nationalist overtones to his poetry, and therefore it's considered problematic. So these kinds of questions were very interesting to me, and I spent a lot of time investigating them, and in that way started to have a different perspective on Israel, both in its conflict with the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and also in terms of being a Jewish state, what a Jewish state requires to maintain itself and its legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens.
What are the key themes of your new book, Blood and Religion? What do you hope readers will learn that they may not have been exposed to until now?
Well, I hope it will open up the whole question of what Israel has been doing since 1948, what its intentions are, and whether it's really interested in peace with the Palestinians at any level, inside its own borders, borders that the international community recognizes, and also in terms of the Palestinians living in the occupied territories. One of the major issues in the book, one of the things I look at quite closely, and I don't think anybody else has really looked at, is a movement that developed in the 1990s following the Oslo peace process, what people term the peace process. Now, the point of Oslo was to set in motion a process which most people believed would lead to two nations being established, two certain nations, neighboring nations, a Jewish state and Israel, inside defined borders, and also a new Palestinian state that most people assumed would be in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the question that was left unclear, but I think Israeli leaders had a very clear idea. What it implied was what was going to happen to the Palestinians inside Israel, this fifth of the population who are Palestinians. Where would they stand after this peace process had taken effect? Now, we know from what the Israeli leadership was saying at the time that they had very strong views that the Palestinians should renounce, inside Israel, should renounce all claims to a national identity of any kind, any ideas of cultural autonomy, just being Palestinians, having control over their own institutions could not be allowed. And what happened from the Palestinian community inside Israel was the opposite. They started to realize that they were going to remain inside Israel. There wasn't going to be a one-state solution. There were going to be two states, and they were going to be in the Israeli state, not the Palestinian state. So it was clear to them that their Israeli citizenship was a given to both sides, to the Palestinian side and to the Israeli side. And therefore, they had to think very clearly for the first time about what their Israeli citizenship meant. They'd been living with discrimination for 5 decades and hadn't really confronted that question. They'd left it as a final status issue, along with all the other ones like Jerusalem and the refugees and so on. So this question of what was going to happen to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, what they themselves wanted, had not really been addressed until the Oslo peace process kicked in the 1990s. So in about 96, 97, we saw a new development among the Palestinians inside Israel, which is that they started demanding real citizenship. For the first time, they said, well, OK, we don't want this second-class kind of citizenship. We want genuine citizenship. We want equality with the Jews inside the state. And they gave this campaign a label. They called what they were demanding was a state of all its citizens. Azmi Bashara, who was one of their leading politicians, articulated this particularly, this notion, but it was accepted by all the political groups within the community, and generally it was a popular idea. Now for Israel it created major problems. Israel realized that the idea of a state of all its citizens, just the idea of it, was problematic because it immediately highlighted that Israel wasn't quite what it was claiming to be, which was a Jewish and democratic state. It started to suggest that there was a conflict between the Jewish definition of the state and its democratic self-definition, that these things were opposed rather than complementary. And so the Palestinians inside Israel and their campaign, political campaign that really took off in the late 1990s, became extremely problematic for Israel. And the Israeli leadership started to rethink its relationship with the Palestinians inside Israel. And that's really, I'm looking at what happened from the beginning of the Intifada. The Intifada was an important turning point, not only for the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also for the Palestinians inside Israel, living as citizens. Because what happened at that point was that Israel realized it had a pretext for treating the Palestinians as a fifth column. As soon as there was an intifada, it could redefine the Palestinian population inside Israel, no longer as just ordinary citizens, but as a fifth column of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And it found that moment when it could redefine its Palestinian citizens at the very moment when the intifada erupted in the occupied territories, because at that moment there were demonstrations in support of the Palestinians in the major cities in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, Palestinian cities, such as Nazareth here. And Israel used that as an opportunity to reimagine its Palestinian population, to recraft the image of the Palestinian population inside Israel for its own Israeli citizens, its Jewish Israeli citizens. And what it did was send in the police force, heavily armed, with rubber bullets and with live ammunition, and started shooting at demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators inside Palestinian cities like Nazareth, treating them exactly the same way as the army was treating the Palestinians in the occupied territories, leading most Israeli Jews to make the connection, which is that if the army needed to use this kind of force against the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and the police needed to use the same kind of force against Palestinians inside Israel, then they must be doing the same kind of thing. They must be subversive in the same kind of way.